Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of Sorastro's Descent painting series. In this episode, we're going to paint the Merriods from Fantasy Flight Games' Descent Journeys in the Dark 2nd edition. The Merriods are quite a lot of fun to work on, and can actually be painted up quite quickly. As you can see, I've done my best to capture the look of the character art, and chosen to have a play with some dripping slime and water effects. Let's take a look at the painting stages. After filling in some gaps and removing mould lines, I'm going to create a rocky texture for the base, leaving space for the water effects which I'll be adding later. I'll then be providing a prime in grey with an optional spray of white for the front. Next we'll apply the base colours using some wet blending along the way to quickly lay the colours down, followed with some skin markings and some high contrast highlights to create a wet shiny look. For the finishing touches, I'll be using some water effects to add some pools to the base, along with some dripping pieces of water or slime. Let's begin. After removing any obvious mould lines with a craft knife, I'm now filling in some of the gaps using Vallejo's matte varnish. A couple of layers of this may be needed for the larger gaps on the model. I'm then going to roughly plot where I want to place my pools of water. And I'm now building up some rocky texture for the non-liquid areas of the base, using Vallejo's Dark Earth basing paste, although any paste would do. For the areas of water, I'm going to brush some paste on somewhat thinly, just to create a little texture, but without the height. Once dry, additional paste can be added to build up the height of the rocky areas. I'm now priming the model using Badger's Steinolres Grey Primer. Although it isn't essential, I'm now spraying some pure white, using Vallejo's Dead White, to the front of the monster. This is simply to make it easier for us to achieve the white tone of the stomach area later. We're now ready to add some colour. I'm now going to create a gradient for the skin tone, and I'm using dark sea blue for the darkest areas, followed with the more vibrant blue-green, and then some pure white, and I'm using Schmincke's titanium white for this. It's not essential, but here I'm adding a little retarder to give me a little more time to work with the paint on the miniature. Although I'm using a wet palette, there would be nothing wrong with creating a similar gradient across 4 or 5 wells in a dry palette, as you've seen me do in previous episodes. I've also chosen to mix a little Warpfiend Grey into the white end of the gradient. I'm using a size 2 Series 8 brush by Rosemary Co, and I'm beginning by blocking in the areas of dark skin, using the character art as a guide. I'm now reaching for a lighter tone. And after giving the brush a quick rinse and a wipe, I'm loosely blending the colours on the model. I'm now jumping to a very pale tone for the end of the tail. And I'm once again wet blending the tones on the figure. I'm now carrying on round the rest of the monster, blocking in the colours and roughly blending the tones as I go. I'm not too concerned about achieving especially smooth blends, partly because we'll be overriding some of these transitions with some additional noise and skin markings in a while. After a first quick pass, I'm now going back in to strengthen the tone of the pale frontal sections of the monster, and I'm also beginning to build up some highlights and shadows. I'm now also beginning to build up some highlights on the darker areas of skin, notably for the top of the head and face. I'll be returning to push the highlights further in a while, but now I'm going to take some fluorescent green and brush this quite thinly over the border between the dark and light patches of skin. I'm now adding a second layer to boost the saturation. Next I'm going to mix some Naggaroth Night and some black into the dark sea blue to push the depth in the shadows. I'm also now going to begin drawing in some skin markings, largely inspired by the character art. As well as the striped patterns, I've also chosen to add some mottled textures like you can see here. This is a nice way to add interest to the model, whilst also helping to obscure any transitions you may not be happy with. I'm now mixing some of the fluorescent green with some white, and I'm using this to draw on the very pale markings we can see on the tentacles. And here I've chosen to brush some of the fluorescent green into the shadows of the torso, almost like a green cast coming up from the pools of water below. I'll be returning to the skin in a moment to add my final highlights, but first I'm going to paint the inside of the mouth, or mouths, using Bugman's Glow, which we can apply quite thinly. Whilst that dries, I'm going to paint all of the claws using pure black. I'm now returning to the primary mouth, where I'm going to darken the deeper recesses by mixing some Naggaroth Night and some black into the Bugman's Glow. Next I'm going to pick out the teeth with some Ivory. And I'm now going to shade the mouths using Reikland Fleshshade. I'm now going to highlight the gums by mixing some white into my Bugman's Glow in a couple of stages. Next I'm going to paint the eyes by first applying an undercoat of pure white. Which I'm now going to paint over with some fluorescent yellow. With those facial details complete, I'm now going to return to the skin where I really want to push the highlights, often all the way up to pure white, to create a shiny wet appearance. I'm not aiming for a particularly refined look here, and you can see that I'm applying these highlights quite quickly. I'm more interested in creating a striking overall impression through the bold use of contrast. Here I'm glazing a little of the fluorescent yellow onto the highlights surrounding the eyes. And I'm now adding some white to my black in a couple of stages to create some sharp highlights for the claws. With the highlights complete, we're ready to add some finishing touches. I'm now going to paint the rocky areas of the base using some USA Olive Drab mixed with a little dark sea blue. I'm then going to dry brush this using Naggaroth Fleshshade to pick out the texture. I've chosen to add some white to push things a little further. For the areas of water, I'm going to play around with my green and blue tones, and I'm initially using the fluorescent green to mark out the border of the pools, which I'm then blending into some dark sea blue. Here I've chosen to tone the green down by desaturating it with some white. I'm now going to brush a little of the fluorescent green onto the surrounding rocks to create the impression of a faint green glow or cast being given off from the water. This would now be a good time to paint the rim of the base and provide a protective matte spray before adding the water effects. For the pools, I'm simply going to apply a couple of layers of Woodland Scenic's realistic water. I'm using a spare medicine syringe to apply the effect, and then teasing out the edges with a spare brush. This ought to be left for 24 hours to fully cure, during which time some shrinkage will occur, so I'm now applying a second layer. Whilst that dries, I've chosen to create some drips of water or slime using Woodland Scenic's water effects. All I'm doing here is depositing the effect onto some baking paper in thin strips, creating a range of sizes appropriate to the scale of the miniature. After 24 hours, we can see that the effect has dried to a clear finish and can now be easily removed from the paper. To apply the drips, I'm simply dabbing the end of each one into the realistic water effect that we used to create the pools earlier on. I'm then hanging the drips from various parts of the monster. I might also brush on some of the realistic water effect to smooth over some of the joins. Getting the drips to hang as vertically as possible may take a bit of trial and error, but the fact the realistic water dries quite slowly means we have plenty of time to manipulate things until we have a look we're happy with. Once dry, I'm finishing the Merriods off with a few final highlights. And here I'm providing a final boost to the green cast on the underside of the monster. And this completes the Merriods. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the episode. Please note that full details of products and brushes used can be found in the description below, along with links to where you can connect with me across a range of social media platforms. As I've covered the remaining base set miniatures as PDF guides over on Patreon, I will soon be exploring some of the exciting expansion miniatures for the game. As always, my sincere thanks go to the amazing patrons for funding this work. As each video takes a week or more to produce, it's only with such funding that I'm able to produce this content, and I'm incredibly grateful for the ongoing support. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Descent: Journeys in the Dark. Happy painting!